Let me tell you something about power. Real power. It doesn't boast. It doesn't threaten. It waits, it watches, and when the moment comes, it responds with terrifying clarity. That's India, a nation that has endured thousands of years of invasions, colonial subjugation, and internal upheaval, yet it stands, stronger, sharper, and more focused than ever. You see, people underestimate India. They think of Bollywood, spirituality, maybe cricket, but few outside understand the depth of India's military capacity. Fewer still grasp the philosophy that powers it. India is not interested in domination, it's interested in sovereignty. That's an entirely different psychological posture. It doesn't posture to impress, it stands ready to defend. India's military isn't a machine made of metal and missiles, is an institution built from millions of minds trained to respond under pressure and to operate under the weight of history, strategy, and sacrifice. Over 1.4 million active personnel across the Army, Navy, and Air Force. That's not just a number. That's a living, breathing force. And unlike many militaries driven purely by strategy, India's forces are guided by civilizational memory of what it means to be invaded, to be divided, to be occupied. And look at what they're doing today. The modernization of the army is not just a bureaucratic exercise. It's a wartime preparation mindset. Infantry is being rearmed with cutting-edge rifles. Artillery is being upgraded, and armored regiments are moving toward indigenous platforms. But it's not just the land forces. The Indian Navy has launched into blue water capabilities. IN's Vikrant, India's first indigenously built aircraft carrier, isn't just a ship, it's a declaration. It says we are no longer defending the shore. We're projecting stability far beyond it. Now think of the skies. The Indian Air Force is not only flying French Rafales or Russian Su-30S, it's now relying on its own, the HAL Tejas. These jets are not symbols, they're signs of independence. The very idea of depending on foreign systems for sovereignty is being rejected. And that rejection is serious. It's psychological warfare turned inward toward dependency, and India is winning it. But nothing reveals a nation's true intent like its nuclear policy. And India's is terrifying in its clarity. No first use. You won't find India threatening mushroom clouds, but you will find it quietly building a second strike capability with sea-based assets and long-range ballistic missiles. You don't do that unless you mean business. You don't build a triad unless you're planning to survive the first punch and still respond with crushing certainty. And that's what deterrence looks like. Not loud, not reckless, but absolutely final. India has never been the aggressor, but when its borders are crossed, when its sovereignty is challenged, it has shown again and again that it does not bend. Ask those who tested it in 1965, 1971, 1999. Ask those who underestimated the surgical strikes across the line of control or the airstrikes in Balakot. These weren't just military responses, they were messages from a civilization that knows what it stands for. This is not about nationalism. This is about duty. A soldier in the Indian Armed Forces doesn't just fight for a flag, he fights for his ancestors, for the soil soaked in sacrifice, for the future his children will inherit. That kind of motivation can't be bought, it can't be faked. It's forged in the fire of struggle and sustained by a deep sense of purpose. So let me say this plainly, don't mess with India. Don't test its patience because it's long. Don't test its strength because it's quiet. But if you do, know this, India will not start the war, but it will end it. That's not a threat. That's a warning written in history. And history, if nothing else, always returns. India's military might is not just a matter of statistics. It is not simply the sum of battalions, brigades, missiles, and squadrons. It is a living force born out of an ancient civilization's will to survive, defend, and rise. When you speak about India's armed forces, you're not just referring to an institution. You are acknowledging the muscle memory of a culture that has been invaded, looted, broken, and bled, yet never disappeared. You are confronting a nation that never begged for sympathy, never demanded revenge, but stood firm in silence, waiting patiently for its moment to rise. The strength of India's military is not just how many tanks it possesses or how many soldiers stand in formation. It lies in the reason why they stand. What drives a young man to walk away from comfort, from home, from his mother's prayers, and walk toward a battlefield where the outcome may be death? It's not blind obedience. It's something older, something deeper, a sense of duty that is embedded in the Indian spirit, a knowledge passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, that there are things worth protecting. And for India, protection has always meant more than just defending land. It has meant guarding values, heritage, memory, and meaning. There's an emotion that moves through the ranks of the Indian military that outsiders often miss. It's not arrogance, it's not aggression, it's resolve. The quiet, fierce resolve of people who know their history, who know that every border etched on a map was once a line drawn in blood, who remember what it meant to have their freedom taken away, who carry within their bones the pain of partition, the scars of war, the trauma of terrorism, and who made a collective decision, never again. And this decision doesn't shout, it doesn't demand applause, it trains, it marches, it works in the shadows. India's military might is terrifying, not because it parades power, but because it doesn't need to, because its power isn't for show, it's for defense. Its strength isn't in conquering others, but in ensuring it will never be conquered again. People forget how young India is as a nation state and how old it is as a civilization. That contradiction breathes through its military. It is simultaneously modern and ancient, high-tech and deeply spiritual. A missile system developed in the 21st century is operated by someone who bows his head in prayer before launching. A fighter pilot flying at supersonic speed still carries with him the lessons his grandfather learned with a rifle in the jungle. It is that fusion of mind and soul. The country has poured decades into creating a force that doesn't just protect its physical boundaries, but reinforces its moral spine. Every soldier who stands at the icy heights of Siachen, every sailor navigating the volatile waters of the Indian Ocean, every airman flying sorties along the tense borders is not doing so because someone paid them well. They do it because they believe in something larger than themselves, something sacred. And that belief, that unshakable faith in the need to preserve India's dignity, that is the most dangerous weapon any military can possess. When the world looks at India, it often sees a chaotic democracy, a noisy and emotional public, a patchwork of religions and languages, but that is only the surface. Beneath that surface is steel, a kind of national consciousness that remembers every betrayal, every sacrifice, every time a young man died alone at the border while the rest of the country slept peacefully. And it is in honor of those silent martyrs that India's military has evolved, not to strike first, but to strike back so powerfully, so decisively, that no enemy would ever want to test its patience again. And what makes that military so terrifying is not just the heart, it's the will, the unrelenting clarity that India must stand because the cost of falling again is too great. Because history has already taught India what happens when you trust too much, prepare too little, speak too softly for too long. That mistake will never be repeated. This is not the India of 1947 scrambling to hold itself together. This is not the India of 1962 caught off guard in the mountains. This is not even the India of 1999 learning how to respond to covert aggression. This is a new India, an India that has learned, adapted, absorbed the pain, and transformed it into strategy. An India whose military is no longer reactive but proactive, no longer dependent but increasingly self-reliant, no longer unsure but deeply certain of who it is and what it must protect. So if you ask what makes India's military so terrifying, understand this: it's not the size of the army, it's the depth of its purpose. It's not the reach of its missiles, it's the reasons why those missiles were built. It's not the noise of its parades, it's the silence of its fallen, and the promise that their sacrifice will never be in vain. India's military today is not a loose collection of 3 isolated forces. It is a unified, deeply coordinated, and increasingly self-reliant entity that is moving with quiet confidence towards strategic autonomy. The synergy between the Army, Navy, and Air Force is not just operational, it is philosophical. It represents a shift in India's identity as a regional power and a guardian of its own destiny. The very idea of military preparedness in India has evolved from being reactive to proactive, from dependent to indigenous, and from fragmented to synchronized. There was a time when each branch of the Indian Armed Forces functioned like islands, doing their job, serving with honor, but lacking deep integration. That time has passed. Today, the Indian military is walking toward a unified doctrine where land, sea, and air are no longer seen as separate theaters of action, but as one continuous strategic canvas. A threat on the border is no longer just an army problem. It becomes a multi-domain challenge. A disturbance at sea is not just a naval event. It demands air power, satellite support, cyber coordination, and intelligence from across services. This understanding is not just theoretical, it's being practiced, drilled, and transformed into action every single day. The formation of integrated theater commands is a reflection of this evolution. It's not just about command structure, it's about mindset. It's about realizing that victory in modern warfare does not come from brute force alone, but from unity of purpose, from the ability to move like one body, to think like one brain. India is learning this lesson, not from textbooks, but from scars. Each skirmish, each infiltration, each time the enemy struck from a blind spot, taught India the cost of delay, of confusion, of disunity. And so, this generation of military leadership is doing what previous ones couldn't, breaking down silos, building trust, and forging cohesion between the services that used to operate in parallel lanes. But this transformation is not just organizational, it's technological and cultural. Indigenous development is now at the core of India's military future. The world used to treat India as a buyer, a client, a dependent partner. That world is ending. Today, India builds, India innovates. From the BrahMos missile, a symbol of joint Indo-Mushan excellence, to the HAL Tejas, the pride of Indian aerospace engineering, and the Arjun tanks rolling off domestic assembly lines, India is proving that it no longer needs to borrow power. It is generating its own. And this self-reliance is not born out of arrogance. It's born out of necessity. Every time India faced arms embargoes, every time allies hesitated, every time supplies were delayed in critical moments, India learned a harsh truth. Dependence is a weakness. A military that cannot control its own inventory cannot fully control its own fate. And so the Indian defense ecosystem began to shift, not overnight, but steadily, persistently. Today, defense startups are emerging, partnerships are forming, and a silent revolution is taking place. A country that once relied on imported rifles is now exporting artillery, UAVs, and even missile systems. This change is deeply emotional because it touches on a core wound. India was once a great civilization whose scientific achievements were crushed under the weight of colonization. Its knowledge systems were dismantled, its artisans disrespected, its innovations ignored. To reclaim the ability to produce, to engineer, to build, this is more than industrial growth. It is psychological healing. Every ship launched from Indian shipyards, every radar built by Indian hands, every weapon tested by Indian engineers is not just a tool, it is a declaration: we are back. And this resurgence has made the synergy between the forces even more potent, because now the army does not just fight on the ground, it communicates with satellites launched by its own space agency. The Navy doesn't just patrol, it projects force with indigenous submarines and destroyers equipped with Indian systems. The Air Force doesn't just fly, it flies aircraft made in India, maintained in India, and soon perhaps designed entirely by Indian minds. That kind of synergy, built on self-reliance, creates a psychological edge. It breeds confidence, not the superficial kind that comes from parades and slogans, but the quiet kind that makes a force deadly when provoked. Because when each branch of the military can trust that the others will move with them, speak their language, match their rhythm, it creates a kind of unity that cannot be disrupted by surprise. That is the terrifying beauty of India's evolving defense doctrine. It is no longer waiting to be pushed into action. It is ready, always and everywhere. This is not just strategy. It is survival. In a neighborhood as volatile as India's, bordered by hostile forces, surrounded by shifting alliances, unity is not a luxury. It is a lifeline. And India's tri-service synergy, fueled by its growing self-sufficiency, is its shield. A shield built not only by engineers and soldiers, but by 1 billion people who know what it means to live in freedom and are determined never to lose it again. So the next time someone doubts India's military might, tell them to look again, not just at the missiles or tanks or planes, but at the philosophy behind them, the coordination, the trust, the homegrown excellence, because that is where the real power lies, not in the metal, but in the minds and hearts behind it. And that is what makes India a force no one should dare provoke. India's nuclear posture is not just a line in a policy document. It is a reflection of its soul, a restrained, ancient soul that has seen too much blood to crave war, but has also suffered too much injustice to ever bow again. There is something profoundly terrifying about a nation that wields the most destructive weapons ever built with such steady hands, with such quiet control. The world often misunderstands this silence. Some mistake it for weakness. Others mistake it for hesitation. But those who understand India's history know better. They know this silence is not passive, it is deliberate. It is the silence of a guardian, not a predator. India has always walked a unique line when it comes to nuclear power. It does not build to impress. It does not parade warheads to provoke fear. It does not test to dominate. It builds because it must. It defends because it has no choice. There's a kind of trauma embedded in the Indian consciousness, a memory of partition, of vulnerability, of being surrounded by forces that did not always wish it peace. And from that trauma, a promise was born that India would never again be found unprepared, that it would never again plead for mercy when it could stand for dignity. The doctrine of no first use is not just a policy. It's a psychological declaration. It says, we do not seek to destroy, but we refuse to be destroyed. We will not strike first, but if we are struck, we will strike back with such clarity, with such resolve, that the attacker will have no second chance. That is not rhetoric. That is deterrence. That is what it means to hold fire, not out of fear, but out of principle. And let's be clear, this principle is backed by capability. India is not building paper threat. It is building credible, diverse, and survivable platforms. The nuclear triad, land-based missiles, air-delivered bombs, and submarine-launched systems is not just a strategic requirement, it is a psychological firewall. It ensures that even if an enemy's first blow lands, India will always have the power to respond. That power is what deters enemies from ever throwing that first blow. The ballistic missile arsenal, from Agni to Prithvi to the upcoming longer-range systems, is not a show of might. It's an insurance policy written in rocket fuel. These missiles are not waved in anger. They are stored with patience. They are tested, refined, perfected, not to be used, but to ensure they never have to be. Each test launch is not a threat to the world. It is a reminder that India will never again kneel, that it has earned the right to peace through preparedness. And beneath all this hardware is something far more powerful, a doctrine of control. Unlike many nuclear powers who flirt with brinkmanship, India has built its nuclear command structure on discipline and restraint. Political authority remains central. Civilian oversight is non-negotiable. This is a nation that understands the cost of chaos. It does not leave its deadliest tools to chance or ego. It places them under the strictest order because it knows what is at stake, not just for itself, but for humanity. That emotional burden is real. The men and women who serve in India's Strategic Forces Command do not carry their duties lightly. They live in constant readiness, in constant awareness that their role, if ever activated, would change the world forever. And yet they serve, not because they desire war, but because they understand that sometimes the only way to prevent catastrophe is to be strong enough to face it. There's a kind of nobility in that role, a kind of sorrow too, because every warhead India builds is a reminder that peace is still fragile, that deterrence is necessary, that trust among nations is still rare. But this sadness does not weaken India. It strengthens its resolve. Because for India, the nuclear program was never about power. It was about sovereignty. In 1974, when India conducted its first nuclear test, it wasn't claiming dominance. It was reclaiming dignity. It was saying, we are not your colony. We are not your client. We are not your pawn. We are a civilization that gave the world mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Do not think we are incapable of defending ourselves. And that spirit lives on today. It lives in the warheads buried in silence. It lives in the submarines gliding under the sea. It lives in the command rooms, the testing sites, the satellites that watch from above. It is a terrifying kind of power, not because it seeks to destroy, but because it knows how to hold back. Because restraint, when backed by strength, is the most terrifying form of power there is. So if the world is wise, it will understand this. India's nuclear posture is not built on ambition. It is built on memory, on loss, on promises made to the dead. It is built on the belief that peace must be protected with strength. It is a doctrine not of war, but of sacred defense. And those who would test that doctrine must be warned, not with anger, but with truth. You may strike, but if you do, know this: India will not be defeated. India will endure. And India will respond with such devastating clarity that history will remember, not the war, but the foolishness of those who believed a peaceful nation would not fight when its survival was at stake. India's military strategy is not simply about force projection or rapid response. It is about something much deeper, an awakening. It is the quiet evolution of a nation once confined by borders, both geographic and psychological, now stepping into the world with its head held high, not to conquer, but to protect, not to impose, but to influence. And this change, this shift in military strategy, is not a mere administrative update. It's a soul-deep transformation of how India sees itself and how it chooses to move forward in a world full of uncertainty. For decades, India was content to remain focused inward, guarding its borders, avoiding entanglements, and trusting that restraint would be seen for what it was, a form of strength. But time has a way of teaching harsh lessons. The world does not always reward silence. It does not always respect patience. And when one is surrounded by threats, both visible and hidden, staying quiet can be mistaken for weakness. India has learned this through loss, through infiltration, through betrayal, through conflict, and every wound, every scar carved into its soil has taught it that silence alone cannot ensure survival. That defense is not just about holding the line. It is about anticipating when the line will be tested and preparing for it long before the test begins. This is the heartbeat of India's emerging military strategy: anticipation, adaptation, assertiveness. It is no longer enough to react after damage is done. The threats India faces now are faster, more sophisticated, more unpredictable. Drones that strike from the shadows, cyber attacks that dissolve borders into lines of code, terror cells that move across mountain paths in the night. Conventional war is only one part of the equation. The new battlefield is everywhere, on screens, in mines, in skies, at sea. And India is responding with a seriousness that is both inspiring and, to its adversaries, quietly intimidating. Consider the shift in how India approaches its borders. In the past, conflict was managed by posture, presence, and peace talks. Now it is managed by surveillance, high-altitude readiness, rapid infrastructure buildup, and instant mobilization capacity. India no longer waits for threats to arrive. It positions itself so that when they come, they are met with force before they can dig in. Roads have been built at breakneck speed across Himalayan passes. Airstrips now sit nestled in terrains that once saw no presence for miles. Outposts that were isolated now communicate in real time with command centers thousands of kilometers away. This is not about escalation. It is about transformation. A realization that deterrence must be visible, immediate, and decisive. Because when a soldier sees the enemy and must wait for orders that come too late, the cost is measured in coffins. India has grown tired of burying its sons after the fact. It wants to stop the bleeding before it starts. That is the emotional truth behind this new strategy. It is not born of aggression. It is born of grief. And that grief has become clarity. India has begun to engage with the world more assertively. In the Indian Ocean, it is no longer just a coastal nation. It is a maritime power. Patrols are routine. Submarines operate with purpose. Partnerships are strengthening with like-minded nations, not to form empires, but to maintain a balance. Because India knows that when one power grows too bold, unchecked, the first to suffer are the smaller nations who don't have the voice to resist. India has chosen to be that voice, not to dominate, but to defend the idea that freedom of movement, freedom of trade, and freedom of peace are not privileges, they are rights. Even in the air, India's doctrine has shifted. It is not just about scrambling jets when threats appear. It's about making sure those threats think twice before taking off. The induction of new aircraft, the upgrade of older squadrons, the domestication of production, the integration of radar and missile systems, all of it points to one principle: readiness. Because there is nothing more dangerous than being unready in a dangerous world. And India has lived through that danger. It will not repeat it. But all of this, the infrastructure, the alliances, the doctrines, none of it would matter if the spirit behind it was not changing too, and it is. The Indian soldier, the Indian general, the Indian policymaker, they are not just reacting anymore. They are imagining futures not yet written. futures where India is not only safe, but a source of safety for others, where it is not just a victim of aggression, but a shield for the vulnerable. That vision is not a fantasy, it is a responsibility that India is slowly beginning to accept. It is not an easy path. It requires sacrifice. It demands investment. It pulls resources from places that need them. But India has made the decision because it has looked around and seen the instability, the deception, the growing thirst for power at any cost. And it has remembered who it is. A civilization born of thought, forged in fire, and carried through centuries by sheer will. That civilization will not fall in the face of drones or tanks or tyrants. It will adapt. It will rise. It will respond. So when we speak of India's new military strategy, do not think of it as a shift in planning. Think of it as a declaration. We are no longer waiting to be hurt before we act. We are watching, we are building, we are preparing, and we will act, not out of rage, but out of resolve, not to conquer, but to ensure that no one ever believes they can conquer us again.